I don't like the scientists living in this country, so I am going to exile them.
Imagine being so ideologically smug that you look at the brightest physicists on the continent, the very people who built the foundations of modern science, and decide the smartest move is to fire them because of their ancestry. That was the intellectual genius of Nazi Germany in 1933. A regime so committed to racial fantasy that it handed its greatest scientific advantage to the countries it would soon be at war with. When people talk about Germany losing the atomic race, they usually point to Allied industrial power or the Manhattan Project's vast budget. But the truth begins long before the bomb. It starts with a law, a single document, a piece of paper that gutted the heart of German scientific research. The law for the restoration of the professional civil service sounds harmless, almost bureaucratic, but it detonated the academic world. Overnight, Jewish professors, researchers, and assistants were stripped of their positions. They weren't just fired, they were exiled, humiliated, and, most importantly, for the war that would follow. They were freed to take their brains somewhere else, somewhere that would use them. Before 1933, Germany was the global powerhouse of physics. The language of cutting-edge science wasn't English, it was German. Universities in Berlin, Göttingen, and Munich weren't just good, they dominated the global intellectual landscape. If you were studying quantum mechanics or nuclear physics, you were reading German papers, collaborating with German researchers, or studying under German mentors. Einstein's theory of relativity had already reshaped physics. Fritz Haber had revolutionized chemistry. Max Born and Werner Heisenberg were rewriting the rules of the atomic world. If Germany had simply kept this machine intact, it would have had a natural head start in any wartime scientific race. But ideology trumped intelligence. The new regime had no use for Jewish physics, a term cooked up to smear everything from relativity to quantum theory. To the Nazi mind, reality itself was supposed to bend around racial theory. It didn't matter that Einstein's equations worked. It didn't matter that quantum mechanics was mathematically sound. What mattered was that these ideas came from the wrong people. Science became politics, and politics became sabotage. The law of 1933 wasn't a warning shot. It was a self-inflicted wound. By forcing Jewish and dissenting scientists out, Germany didn't just lose talent. It lost the exact minds working on the technologies that would define the next decade of warfare. Look at the list of exiles, and you see the blueprint of the future atomic bomb walking out the front door. Albert Einstein left for the United States. It was his letter to President Roosevelt that triggered early American interest in nuclear chain reactions letter that would never have existed if he hadn't been forced to flee. Leo Szilard, the man who conceived the nuclear chain reaction, also left. Hans Bethe, a German-born theoretical physicist who would become the head of the Manhattan Project's theoretical division, left. Edward Teller, the future father of the hydrogen bomb, left. If you lined up the early meetings of the Manhattan Project, the accents alone told the story. Germany had expelled the team that would eventually build the bomb Germany feared most. The numbers are staggering. In fields like chemistry, Germany lost nearly a quarter of its entire university research staff. Top-tier institutions that had been intellectual engines for decades suddenly found themselves hollowed out. Imagine removing 25% of the brain cells from a functioning system and then expecting it to solve the hardest scientific problem in human history. The remaining German researchers were talented, no doubt, but the ecosystem had collapsed. Scientific advancement isn't just individual genius, it's collaboration, debate, competition, and mentorship. When you purge that many people, you don't just break the machine, you erase the culture that made the machine possible. And the purge didn't stop with the initial law. Positions vacated by world-class scientists were filled by ideologues' people, chosen not for skill, but for loyalty. Laboratories became political zones. Research priorities were determined by racial fantasy, not empirical evidence. German physics became a propaganda slogan. The regime celebrated outdated theories while ridiculing the very work that would define nuclear technology. The physicists who remained often had to navigate a system where supporting Einstein's ideas could be seen as disloyal. Imagine trying to build a nuclear reactor while pretending the scientific foundations of nuclear physics were suspicious. That was the German scientific landscape. Meanwhile, around the world, The scientists who fled Germany built new research networks. Many ended up in Britain, where they continued cutting-edge work. Many more found positions in the United States, where universities like Princeton, Berkeley, and Chicago absorbed them eagerly. These institutions suddenly had access to talent that had once taken Germany generations to cultivate. When World War II began, the Allies didn't start from behind. They started with Germany's former scientific elite, sitting in their classrooms and laboratories. By the time the Manhattan Project officially formed, the United States already had a who's who of theoretical physics living inside its borders. And nearly every one of those names was there because Germany pushed them out. Even worse for Germany, the purge created a false sense of scientific competence. Nazi officials convinced themselves that the dismissal of Jewish scientists didn't matter. They believed talent was replaceable. They believed the racial purity of the replacements somehow made them more reliable. This ideological blindness prevented Germany from recognizing how far behind it truly was. When German military leaders later asked how long it would take to build an atomic weapon, their researchers estimated the problem incorrectly, partly because the remaining scientific community was fragmented, understaffed, and disconnected from global progress. The regime looked at its weakened scientific cores and saw strength. It was the scientific version of standing in an empty room and calling it crowded. This is the core stupidity that defines the story. Germany didn't lose the atomic race because of bad luck, slow industry, or lack of resources. It lost because it fired the winners before the race even began. The scientists who developed the fundamental theories behind atomic physics weren't driven out by war. They were driven out by policy. Nazi Germany believed it could reshape scientific reality through ideology. It believed bloodlines mattered more than brains. It believed loyalty mattered more than competence. And the cost of these beliefs was the very weapon that could have changed the war. This early purge set the stage for every future scientific failure Germany suffered. It shaped the weakness of German nuclear research. It slowed the development of radar. It weakened chemical and engineering programs. It replaced innovation with political theater. The men who replaced the exiled scientists weren't stupid, but they were confined. They were trapped in a structure where questioning the wrong idea could end a career, or worse. A scientific community living in fear is not a scientific community. It is a museum, quiet, sterile, and incapable of new creation. This is the tragedy and the farce of the physics purge. Germany had the world's best team on its own soil. It had decades of dominance. It had universities producing Nobel-level work every few years. And then it burned all of it down to satisfy a fantasy about racial purity. The result was predictable. The exiled scientists built the bomb. Germany built excuses. If you want more deep dives into the most self-sabotaging decisions in history, make sure you like, comment, and subscribe to Dumb Historian. The strange part about the Nazi vision for scientific greatness is how badly it misunderstood what science actually is. Instead of seeing physics as a tool that explains the universe, Nazi leaders treated it like a political argument they could win by shouting louder. The best example of this is their attempt to replace all the modern physics of the early 20th century with something they called German physics. It sounded dramatic, strong, and patriotic, but it was nothing more than ideology wrapped in a lab coat. It grew from ego, fear, and insecurity, and it crippled the very scientific foundation Germany needed if it ever wanted to stand a chance in the new technological age of war. To understand how absurd this was, you have to picture a government so consumed by pride that it believed equations could be racist. That is not an exaggeration. Nazi officials decided that entire fields of scientific thought, especially quantum mechanics and relativity, were not simply wrong but impure. They called them Jewish physics. It did not matter that these ideas had been tested, proven, and accepted by the global scientific community. It did not matter that the leading physicists of the era used them daily. What mattered was that the theories came from thinkers the regime wanted erased. Removing them became a badge of ideological loyalty, like clearing out books that made you uncomfortable. This was the environment in which German physics was born. The loudest voices behind it were not the brightest minds, but the most politically loyal. Two physicists, Philipp Lenard and Johann Stark, both Nobel Prize winners in their earlier careers, helped create it. Their scientific work had value, but their egos were larger than their contributions. They wanted to be seen as guardians of a pure German tradition in science. To do that, they attacked Einstein's theories, calling them degenerate, foreign, corrosive, or dangerous. They had no strong experimental argument. They had resentment, pride, and the attention of a government that shared their anger. Imagine an academic debate where one side uses evidence, experiments, and mathematics, while the other side uses shouting, nationalism, and threats. That was the divide in German science. If you were a young physicist in the 1930s and you wanted a career, you had to choose between real science and political survival. Many bent the knee. Some left the country. Others tried to quietly continue their work under the radar, but the cost was high. Funding, promotions, and recognition were no longer tied to brilliance. They were tied to obedience. The consequences became clear almost immediately. When a nation declares that certain theories are illegal or immoral, it cuts its own legs off. Modern physics was advancing at a breathtaking pace everywhere else. In Britain, researchers were debating nuclear fission. In the United States, refugees from Europe, including many expelled by Germany, worked on quantum mechanics and atomic theory. In Denmark, Niels Bohr led groundbreaking conversations that pulled young minds from all over the world. Meanwhile, Germany's universities were silencing their best thinkers because their ideas did not match the ideology of a dictator. Think of it this way. The Nazis took the scientific equivalent of a Formula One engine and smashed it with a hammer because the engineer who built it had the wrong background. Then they acted shocked when the car did not move. The idea of German physics rejected the core of scientific progress, the value of questioning, the need for new models, and the curiosity that drives discovery. Quantum mechanics described the strange behavior of particles at tiny scales. Relativity changed how scientists understood space, time, and motion. These theories were essential to the development of technologies that would define the 20th century nuclear weapons, radar, electronics, and more. Germany did not simply lose access to new ideas, it declared war on them. This rejection had a direct impact on Germany's ability to compete in the race for atomic energy. The nuclear bomb was not discovered by accident. It was the result of a chain of theoretical insights, many of which came from physicists the Nazis chased out. Einstein's equation, E equals mc, explained the enormous energy inside matter. Quantum mechanics helped explain how neutrons interact with nuclei. Without this foundation, building a bomb would be almost impossible. Germany treated these ideas like forbidden magic, while the Allies treated them like stepping stones. Inside Germany, the scientists who remained felt the weight of this ideology every day. Werner Heisenberg, one of the most important physicists of the 20th century, became a target. Heisenberg was not Jewish. He was German, respected, and brilliant. But he taught quantum mechanics, one of the theories the regime hated. Newspapers attacked him as a supporter of Jewish science. Some officials even suggested jailing him. In a healthy scientific environment, Heisenberg would have led research teams, mentored students, and advanced the frontier of knowledge. Under the Nazis, he had to defend his right to teach reality. The problem with building a scientific program on pride is that pride does not power engines, guide rockets, or split atoms. You can give a speech about German genius, but speeches do not replace missing research. When the war began, Germany discovered this truth in painful ways. Radar research lagged behind. Nuclear research stalled. Even basic theoretical frameworks required to understand atomic energy were incomplete. The regime wanted a shortcut German answer to theories they had thrown away, but science punishes shortcuts with failure. Germany still had talented scientists, but their work was slowed by censorship, suspicion, and ideological pressure. You cannot ask your brightest researchers to think freely while also telling them which thoughts are illegal. Every project became slower, messier, and more confused. Rival schools of thought fought each other. Political loyalty mattered more than accuracy. Nazi officials demanded results, but refused to accept the theories that produced those results. It was like trying to build a skyscraper while banning the use of steel. The irony is that while Germany pushed out its thinkers, the rest of the world picked them up and let them shine. The Manhattan Project, which built the atomic bomb, relied on scientists the Nazis exiled. Hans Bethe became one of the project's intellectual leaders. Leo Szilard first conceived the nuclear chain reaction. Many of these men had been students or colleagues of German scientists before the Purge. Germany had the talent, the training, and the infrastructure. It threw them away because ego blinded its leaders. The failure of German physics was not a slow erosion. It was a collapse caused by arrogance. The regime believed it could redefine reality by force. It believed loyalty mattered more than truth. It believed science would bend. But science does not bend. It reveals. It exposes mistakes. It punishes nations that treat facts as political enemies. Germany could have led the world in physics. It had the universities, the institutes, and the minds. Instead, it built an intellectual prison where the guards knew nothing about the subject they were guarding. The country tried to create a nationalistic version of reality, something clean, simple, obedient, and familiar. The actual universe is none of those things, and it does not care about ideology. The story of German physics shows how ego, when combined with power, destroys potential. The Nazis believed they could choose which ideas were acceptable. They ended up choosing their own scientific defeat. They silenced thinkers who could have changed the course of the war. They attacked theories they needed to understand the modern world. They turned physics from a path to discovery into a battlefield for pride. When people talk about the Manhattan Project today, they usually imagine a secret American super team of brilliant scientists who came together out of nowhere and invented the most powerful weapon in history. But the truth is far more ridiculous and also far more embarrassing for Nazi Germany. The real story is that Hitler, through pure ideology, ego, stubborn pride, and a refusal to listen to anyone outside his own political bubble, practically assembled the Allied nuclear program with his own hands. He didn't just push the best physicists out of Germany. He delivered them straight into the arms of his enemies, and then acted confused when the Allies ended up with the bomb, and he didn't. This is not just a mistake. This is one of the dumbest self-inflicted wounds in the entire war. To see how absurd this gets, you have to understand what Germany looked like before the Nazis rose to power. German universities were the center of global physics. People went there to study because that's where the breakthroughs happened. Quantum mechanics, relativity, nuclear fission, theoretical chemistry. The new frontiers of mathematics Germany was the place where the future lived. American universities were decades behind. Britain had excellent scientists, but not even Cambridge or Oxford could match the scale and density of brainpower coming out of Berlin, Göttingen, Munich, and Heidelberg. If any country was destined to build a superweapon first, it was the one that already held the world record for Nobel Prizes in physics. Then Hitler came in and burned the entire thing down with ideology. He didn't understand physics, and he didn't trust the people who did. He ruled through suspicion, resentment, and a fantasy that Germany could rebuild world-class science without any Jews, without any dissent, and without anything he personally found suspicious or unjust. That meant modern science itself became a target. And the scientists who built the foundations of that science, Einstein, born Beatty, Szilard, Meitner, Gaudsmit, Wigner, Weisskopf, Pauli, many of them Jewish, many politically moderate, liberal, or simply not loyal to the party, were treated as disposable enemies. And here is where the stupidity begins to snowball. Because when you fire your best physicists, they don't just disappear. They don't retire quietly. They don't stop thinking. They don't lose their talent. They move. And the places they moved to were the same places Germany would later declare war on. The Nazis expelled the research that would eventually defeat them. This brings us to one of the most ironic chain reactions in history. When Leo Szilard, a Hungarian Jewish physicist driven out of Europe, settled in the United States, he realized something terrifying. If nuclear fission was possible, then a bomb was possible. And if a bomb was possible, then Germany, home of the greatest pre-Nazi nuclear physicist, would probably try to build one. Szilard didn't want the Nazis to be the first country with a weapon that could level a city. So he went to the one man whose name would instantly grab the attention of world leaders. Albert Einstein, another German Jew, driven into exile. Einstein had no interest in war, but he understood the danger. Together, the two men drafted a letter to President Roosevelt warning that Germany might be working on nuclear weapons and urging the United States to start its own program. That letter created the Manhattan Project. That is not an exaggeration. Without the Nazi purge of scientists, there is no Einstein-Szilard letter. Without that letter, the US government does not invest the enormous amount of money needed to build the bomb. Without that investment, the scientific talent scattered across Europe does not concentrate into a single coordinated project. And without that concentration, the greatest research team ever assembled does not form. Hitler didn't just lose his scientific talent, he handed it to the Allies, and the Allies used it to build the most important weapon of the 20th century. And here's the part that makes it even more absurd. The United States didn't just take in a few scientists. The Manhattan Project was practically built out of refugees. Hans Beatty, one of the key architects of the bomb, Edward Teller, the father of the hydrogen bomb, Enrico Fermi, whose wife was Jewish and who fled Italy because of fascist racial laws, Eugene Wigner, who shaped nuclear engineering, Niels Bohr, smuggled out of Copenhagen while the Nazis were hunting him. Most of the theoretical heavy lifting in the Manhattan Project was done by people who left Europe because authoritarian regimes refused to let them work. It's as if Hitler held the door open for them, tipped his hat politely, and said, "Please, go help my enemies win the war." Now the real comedy begins when you look at what Germany did with the scientists it still had. Instead of building an environment where physics could thrive, the Nazis wasted their time fighting over which type of science was racially pure. They claimed that Einstein's theories were suspicious because they didn't fit their preferred worldview. They said relativity was a conspiracy. They said quantum mechanics was an illusion. They created a fake substitute called German physics, which was not a scientific school but a political tantrum disguised as research. Because of this, real theoretical physics in Germany collapsed. They fell behind in nuclear theory, in particle understanding, in reactor development, and in atomic modeling. It's like trying to win a race while refusing to use wheels because you think they look foreign. Meanwhile, the Allied physicists many trained in Germany before the purges already understood. The theoretical structure needed to build a nuclear chain reaction. They had the formulas, they had the mathematics, they had the experience, they had the equipment, and most important, they had the freedom to explore the ideas without being accused of political disloyalty. Even when Germany finally realized nuclear research mattered, it was too late. Their team was small, their funding was limited, their expertise was shallow, and their theoretical understanding was outdated. They built a reactor that never reached critical mass. They miscalculated uranium requirements. They wasted resources on dead-end designs. And their most talented remaining physicist, Werner Heisenberg, could not fix the damage caused by the earlier purge. While the Manhattan Project built massive research centers with thousands of workers, Germany built an experimental reactor in a basement under a church. That is not a joke, that actually happened. The comparison looks like two different centuries, not two different countries. And it all started with the physics. Purged the policy that chased away the only people who could have given Germany a chance. So when we talk about the Manhattan Project, we aren't talking about a victory that came from nowhere. We're talking about the result of one of the dumbest ideological decisions any wartime government ever made. Hitler believed he made Germany stronger by removing Jewish scientists. In reality, he handed his enemies the exact tool they needed to win the scientific race that defined the century. If you ever need a perfect example of ideology defeating intelligence, this is it. The Nazis didn't lose nuclear physics because the Allies were smarter. They lost it because they were too arrogant to let their own smartest people stay. The strangest part of the entire scientific purge in Nazi Germany isn't the timing, or the scale, or even the sheer stupidity of firing the best physicists in Europe right before launching a global war. The strangest part is that the whole disaster wasn't born in the 1930s at all. It was born in 1918, in a broken country crawling out of a failed world war, full of confusion, anger, shame, and the desperate need to believe that someone else ruined everything. And in that emotional fog, Germany embraced a mytho-poisonous little fantasy that would rot its politics, warp its science, and eventually cripple its war machine. It was called the Dolchstoßlegende, the stab-in-the-back legend. And this myth was so powerful that it convinced a modern nation to replace Einstein with racial ideology, sabotaging its own scientists because the ghost of the last war insisted that loyalty mattered more than knowledge. To understand how Germany reached a point where it rejected entire branches of physics, you have to picture the final months of World War I. The German military was collapsing. Food had run out. The Navy need Allied forces were pushing the front back every day. But when the armistice was signed, most Germans didn't see that collapse. They saw the speeches, the posters, and the propaganda that had been feeding them the idea of imminent victory. The government had spent years saying that the army was undefeated in the field. And when defeat finally arrived, it didn't come with enemy troops marching through Berlin. It came with a signature on a piece of paper. For millions of people, the defeat didn't make sense. If the army never lost a major battle on German soil, who ruined everything, who surrendered too early, who sabotaged the nation, the answer became a story, and the story became a myth. And that myth became the foundation of the Nazi worldview. The Dalstologian claimed that Germany was never actually defeated by the Allies. It claimed that traitors on the home front, Jews, communists, intellectuals, and political liberals had sabotaged the war effort, undermined morale, and forced the army to surrender prematurely. The soldiers on the front lines, still processing the trauma of a brutal industrial war, clung to the myth because it was easier to believe in betrayal than in failure. The generals embraced it because it let them escape blame, and the civilians accepted it because it soothed the unbearable shock of defeat. This idea settled deep into the national psyche, shaping everything that came after it. It hardened German politics, it fed the rise of extremist parties, and it created an obsession with internal enemies. But most importantly for this story, it shaped how a generation of Germans viewed intelligence, academic life, and especially scientific fields dominated by Jewish thinkers. When the Nazis came to power, they didn't just inherit a country. They inherited that myth. They inherited a cultural belief that intellectuals were dangerous, that critical thinkers were unpatriotic, and that any group associated with the internal enemy of 1918 had to be purged to prevent another national catastrophe. For Hitler and his circle, the defeat of World War I wasn't an event, they saw it as a warning that internal enemies were more dangerous than external ones. And when you combine that belief with racial ideology, you get a government that thing created by Jewish thinkers must somehow be part of the same intellectual betrayal that stabbed Germany in the back during the First World War. It sounds unbelievable now, but for the Nazis, it felt consistent. They equated Einstein with the Weimar era they hated. They associated theoretical physics with cosmopolitanism, liberalism, and modernity, the very things the Dolchstoß's myth taught them to distrust. And so, instead of embracing the scientific revolution happening right in their universities, they launched a cultural counter-revolution against thought itself. This is where the German physics movement came in. It tried to reduce physics to something moral, grounded, racially pure, and ideologically safe. It turned academic research into a loyalty test, not a field of inquiry. Men like Leonard and Stark argued that the great discoveries of the early 20th century relativity, quantum mechanics, atomic theory, were fundamentally corrupt because they were born from the minds of people. The Dolchstoß myth had taught them to fear, and once racial fear becomes scientific policy, the results are catastrophic. Picture a physics department in 1930s Germany. The students are eager, the labs fully equipped, the professors world-class. Then the purges begin. First, the Jewish professors are dismissed. Some escape, some are arrested, some simply vanish. Their research is halted mid-sentence, their projects are abandoned, their students lose mentors, their assistants lose direction. Overnight, a field that was pushing the global frontier is thrown into chaos. And the people replacing these expelled scientists aren't new Einsteins. They are bureaucrats, party loyalists, and ideologues chosen for obedience instead of brilliance. This is the moment when the shadow of World War I reaches across decades and strangles Germany's scientific future. Because the purge isn't just removing experts, it is removing the culture of scientific ambition that made German science great in the first place. Before the Nazis, Germany was the center of theoretical physics. It produced Nobel Prizes the way other countries produced sausages. It was the place where young physicists went to study at the birthplace of modern science. But the Dalstologian turned that heritage into a target. By the time the war began, the damage was permanent. The effects spread far beyond academia. When Germany started exploring nuclear research, it lacked the theoretical backbone that the Allies possessed. When the Army considered atomic possibilities in 1939, the scientists still remaining were either ideologically compromised or intellectually isolated. They underestimated critical mass. They misunderstood neutron behavior. They dismissed the practical feasibility of a bomb. The Dolchstoß myth had created a world where independent thinking was a threat, so no one challenged mistakes. No one pushed boundaries. No one dared contradict the narrative. And so the country that had once been home to the brightest physicists on Earth couldn't. Even build a functioning research program. Meanwhile, across the ocean, the very people Germany expelled were building the Manhattan Project. Szilard's experiments, Beatty's calculations, Fermi's reactor, Einstein's letter, Teller's theories, Born's mathematics, all of it every discovery that accelerated the Allied push toward the atomic bomb carried. The fingerprints of men who would have been working in Germany, if not for the ideological consequences of World War I. Think about the irony. The myth that Germany lost World War I because of internal betrayal created the exact conditions that made Germany lose World War II. The belief that Jewish scientists were a threat produced the reality that Jewish scientists built the weapon that ended the war against Germany. And the fear of another internal enemy drove the Nazis to expel the very people who could have given them the scientific edge they needed. The Dolchstoß myth wasn't just a political fantasy, it was a self-fulfilling prophecy. Germany believed it had been betrayed from within. And so, in trying to prevent that imagined betrayal from ever happening again, it betrayed itself. It sacrificed genius on the altar of ideology. It replaced quantum mechanics with nationalism. It replaced relativity with racial paranoia. And in the end, it replaced victory with defeat. Suddenly found itself unable to do the one thing everyone expected it to do first. In 1939, German scientists split the atom. Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann uncovered the key to the most destructive force on Earth. The technology sat right in their hands. But the moment the discovery reached the upper ranks of the Nazi leadership, the entire effort derailed. It wasn't sabotage by spies. It wasn't a lack of materials. It wasn't an industrial problem. It was ego. It was ideology. It was the complete. You can trace the collapse of the Uran-Varine from the first meeting of the German Nuclear Committee. The brightest physicists were already gone, either fired or forced to flee. Many of the remaining scientists worked under suspicion. Others were split between military and civilian projects, turning what should have been one unified program into a scattered collection of small labs competing for attention. The government did not understand nuclear physics, so it threw money at pet projects. Instead of building a coordinated research network, the problem was simple. The Nazi state wanted a miracle weapon without investing in the human infrastructure needed to build one. They wanted a shortcut. They wanted results without understanding, and the price was complete failure. The early experiments in heavy water, uranium moderation, and reactor design proved how far the Germans had fallen behind. They did not have the mathematicians who could model neutron behavior at scale. They did not have enough qualified physicists to run controlled fission experiments safely. They did not even have the industrial capacity to produce large quantities of enriched uranium, because they fired the people who could have built the infrastructure. Every time a German laboratory approached a breakthrough, a lack of manpower or a political interruption dragged progress backwards. Scientific advancement demands stability, internal cooperation, and a willingness to challenge assumptions. Nazi Germany crushed all three. Heisenberg's role in this collapse remains a debated topic, but the structural problems are. He worked with a fraction of the needed staff, limited resources, and a leadership structure that refused to prioritize nuclear research at the level required. The German state spent far more money on propaganda films than on uranium enrichment. They poured steel and fuel into the V-2 rocket program instead of reactor construction. They wasted industrial output on WWII fantasies rather than the boring but essential process of building a real nuclear chain reaction. When Heisenberg built his famous uranium cube reactor, he lacked the materials for a full-scale test. He had to hang the cubes like ornaments in a hollow sphere, hoping the geometry would work, because they did not have enough heavy water or pure graphite to complete a stable core. Imagine trying to build a car with half an engine. That was the state of German nuclear science. Oak Ridge, Los Alamos, Hanford, These were ecosystems, scientific ecosystems, where mathematicians, chemists, physicists, engineers, machinists, and soldiers worked under one umbrella. Germany had Heisenberg stuck in a cave under a church in Haigerloch, trying to make a nuclear reactor grow like a potted plant with no sunlight. If you want to understand why one side succeeded and the other collapsed, it comes down to scale. The Manhattan Project employed over 100,000 people. The German program employed a handful of underfunded scientists with conflicting directions from party officials, who cared more about loyalty than competence. But the irony cuts deeper. The Allies got their nuclear experts from Germany. America built the atomic bomb with refugee talent. The very men Hitler threw out, Hans Bethe wrote the theory of stellar nucleosynthesis. Szilard invented the nuclear chain reaction. Fermi led the first reactor team. Teller built the early hydrogen bomb theory. Einstein signed the letter that sparked U.S. nuclear mobilization. None of these men worked for Germany because Germany told them they were not welcome. It is the most self-destructive hiring decision in history. Firing the people who understand the new science, then complaining that the new science isn't progressing. When you look at the German program, you see a pattern. They never unified their reactor research. They never produced the industrial base for uranium enrichment. They never resolved the argument between heavy water and graphite moderators. They never agreed on whether the purpose of the program was energy, a reactor, or a bomb. Every lab solved a different piece of a puzzle that no one at the top bothered to assemble. The Nazi leadership did not value scientific planning. They valued results, praise, and ideological purity. And science does not survive under those conditions. It needs patience. It needs long-term investment. It needs freedom to test, fail, and revise. The Nazi state punished dissent, rewarded fantasies, and demanded miracles. The result became clear by 1942. Germany was no longer in the nuclear race. The Allies feared they might be, but the fear was based on Germany's reputation, not its reality. Behind closed doors, the Uhrenverein argued about funding. They argued about theory. They argued about geometry and reactor construction. They argued about who should lead. Meanwhile, the American program tested reactors the size of buildings. The difference was not intelligence. It was structure. It was organization. It was mindset. The darkest irony of all is that German scientists understood the theory behind the bomb. They knew a bomb required precise, rapid assembly of supercritical mass. They knew the physics. They wrote the math. But the Nazi regime never gave them the industrial base to turn equations into machines. A nuclear bomb is 10% theory and 90% engineering. Germany only invested in the 10%. In the final months of the war, Allied soldiers found the remnants of the German project. Reactor parts packed into crates, diagrams that led nowhere, and notebooks full of unrealized calculations. The program had become a ghost, a shadow of what it could have been if Germany had valued intelligence over ideology. The war ended, and the world understood the lesson. The most destructive weapon ever built came from the minds the Nazis rejected. You can draw a straight line from the expulsions of 1933 to the Enola Gay lifting off in 1945. If you want more breakdowns of the strangest, dumbest, and most catastrophic historical decisions ever made, make sure you like, comment, and subscribe to Dumb Historian.